It is August 8th at 3:45 in the afternoon. I'm at the National Bureau at 1010 Mass Ave, and I'm interviewing Robert Lipsey. And if you'd be so kind, Robert, to tell us a bit about yourself and when you came to the Bureau, and any other details you'd like to share.
So I started at the Bureau in June 1945, and the way it came about was that I received a letter in the mail from Jeff Moore asking me if I would like to work at the Bureau, and saying that he was writing at Arthur Burns' suggestion. I had been a student of Burns, although I doubt that he knew me very well, but I think that other assistants may have mentioned my name to him and suggested me. And so
you were a student, this is when you were an undergraduate?
No,
this
I
is
was
a
a
graduate
graduate student.
Okay.
the year before
Mm-hmm.
I came to the Bureau. And I was interviewed by Jeff Moore, and Jeff was involved in the business cycle program, and I started out working in what was called the business cycle unit, which is the dominant unit of the Bureau. We had more people, and it was that was a continuing project that never had to ask for money. I mean, that was sort of thought of as the core of the Bureau. And I spent 3 months there, partly doing small jobs for Jeff Moore, and partly actually working in the unit. And the unit consisted of, as far as the assistants were concerned, consisted of, I would guess, maybe 6 or 7 assistants, research assistants. And their job was to do the business cycle analysis, but also seasonal corrections. A large part of the man hours went into seasonal corrections, and they were not done as now with pressing a button, but they were done first in a mechanical way. They were charted. Mm-hmm. Moore and Burns would look at them, often reject them, say try a different method, and sometimes could go on for a week before a single series of correction was accepted. And then the business cycle analysis was done on the seasonally corrected data.
Let me just ask you one question. At that moment, the government was not doing seasonal corrections to the same series?
Well, no. The series, I think, were largely published, not corrected, but if some were published corrected, the Bureau would not have accepted the results and would have nevertheless redone the corrections. I don't know how much was published seasonally adjusted at that time, but I know that this was a major part of the work. And it was fairly, for the people doing it, a pretty routine job. It was done with a supervisor in the room who was watching over people, and they were expected to keep to their work, not wander around.
So what was your title? Your title was?
We were all called research assistants,
right.
I think. And the person in charge of that room was Sophie Sakowitz. People who worked there. When I used to meet Ray Vernon, he would ask me about her because he had worked there in the 30s, and he remembered her very well as supervisor. In any case, there were other projects that involved individual research people and typically one assistant. And that was considered a much more desirable job, so that when the opportunity came to move out of this unit was interviewed by Fabricant and saw Fabricant, and he hired me to work for him. So I had a very short experience in that business cycle unit, but a fairly vivid impression.
Do you remember when you were in the business cycle unit, there were other research assistants there. Did you become close friends with, was this also a social context of?
Oh, yes, there was certain social contact, although much more in the other room where people were not so closely supervised, and we did become quite friendly. We'd go out to lunch together, and that was quite a different atmosphere. So that was I was actually called in by Arthur Burns when I was considering moving, and to my surprise, he urged me very strongly not to make that move. And he stressed how highly he thought of Jeff Moore and how important the business cycle work was. But I made the move, nevertheless.
Well, maybe he wanted to keep another really good research assistant working on the business cycle project, of course.
Well, I think Jeff liked me. We had a little more contact. I had more contact with him than the others did. But still, I was quite taken aback that the director of research would call me in for something like that.
Well, it impressed you enough so that you remembered that moment very well.
Oh, yes.
So 3 months went by, so now we're still in 1945, maybe 1946.
45. Yes.
Still 45, and now you're working with
Then
Fabricant.
I began working for Fabricant, and that continued quite a while. This was a project on the growth of government in the United States, which eventually ended in a book, but were preceded by income and wealth paper on government wealth, which I had a fairly large part in, and then papers on government employment and other aspects of it.
So remind me, this was all levels of government. This was federal plus
Yes,
state
the role
plus
of government
local.
in the economy.
Right.
And
And so this
idea
would
that
have begun with, for the local, it could only go back to 1902, right?
Well, looking back to what governments did earlier,
Right.
because for state governments there was information, and there have been histories of local government. One had some idea
Right.
of the role of local government earlier.
But not
But-
really good
but the
series,
statistical
because the
data
statistical
began
data
later,
begins in
right?
1902.
And
right?
basically, that the statistical aspects of the study began mainly with 1900, 1902.
Mhm.
So that, I worked on various aspects of that project for the next few years. And the book finally came out in 1952,
Mhm.
but I had begun, by that time I had been given my own project. And so then I began the project that, first Fabricant was involved in a part of the Kuznets study, which he was looking at, could talk about that. But it was a large study with many people on it. Fabricant had one aspect of it, and that's where I first began working on foreign investment. And I wrote that, the equivalent in those days of working papers on various aspects of foreign investment.
So these were parts of
These
the
were
occasional
inputs.
papers?
No, these were just inputs to
Uh-huh.
the final volume. None of them published. They called working. I'm not sure they have what
They
the
just
title was.
internally circulated, they
These
didn't
are
have to go to
totally
the board
internal.
for review or anything.
No, this was for the project itself. And then, at some point, I was given my own project, which was the price and quantity trends project.
Now, tell me a bit about what you mean by "I was given."
Well, perhaps we should talk about how the Bureau ran
Okay.
in those days, and that it was a very, the decisions about what to do came down from above, and the Bureau decided, that it was going to work on a certain area, presumably. That was the director of research, and the board took part in that decision. People moved from one project to another. They may have had some choice, but they may not have had a lot of choice as to what they would do. It was the project that was given, I was told that I could have this as my own project. I would have financing, I would have research assistants.
Wow,
And,
your own research assistant.
And because it was a very large data collection effort, I had quite a number of assistants to work with. The idea behind it was that it was going to be of help in the business cycle program. But Ilse Mintz was going to do a study of cyclical behavior of trade, exports and imports. There were no quarterly indexes going back far into the past. And so I was going to put together these indexes which would feed into her work. But I had a lot of freedom, and I converted the project to something I was more interested in, which became my dissertation eventually. And I was given a great deal of freedom in hiring people. I never, if I wanted more assistants, I would ask. Mostly,
Yeah.
I got them.
So, but the year that this began, so you were working on business cycles, you worked for Fabricant, and then you were given your own project, and we date that in
Probably
when?
1954. It's
Okay.
hard to date it because the projects blended into, one was finishing off one project and
Right.
starting on another.
Let me deviate for a second. On a personal note, you were an undergraduate at Columbia, now you're a graduate student, and you're working at the Bureau. You're also sort of registered as a graduate student. How did it work? You took some courses, and then you're sort of doing your own thing, and Columbia doesn't really care.
Well, I had 1 year full-time
Right.
at Columbia before I started at the Bureau. And then once I had started, I had to finish my 60 credits, which
I see.
I did, except I guess one course at a time, or two courses. And Columbia was quite relaxed in those days about
I think they still are.
student. Well, no, I think they have tried to impose some time limits. And then I finished, I guess I did a master's. So I did get a master's degree writing a paper under Burns
Uh-huh.
in 1946. On an entirely different topic, which was an interesting experience by itself.
But the Bureau was in part livelihood, and it turned out that it was also the fount of this dissertation. So it had many different virtues.
Well, for me,
Yes.
because I liked the work and I enjoyed having my project. there was not much connection with Columbia. That is, I did this project. I had originally spoken to Ragnar Nurks at Columbia, but he never took any real part in it. When I finished, I brought it back to Columbia, and Albert Hirschman very kindly took it on, and I sat in on his seminar for a year or a term, and he had a lot of helpful ideas, particularly about how to present. He was interested in the results, and he had very good ideas about how to present it. And so I had a project, although I had no particular status. I'm not sure what my title was, but the organization of the Bureau in that time, Bureau had the director of research, who really was the highest ranking person. I guess Moore may have been the associate director, or I'm not sure whether he actually had that title. And then there was what was called then the research staff, which consisted of about 20 people. At its largest, as far as I can remember, maybe half were teaching at universities, and half were full-time Bureau employees. And the Bureau, for quite some time, maintained a full-time research staff, and thought, I think, that was desirable to have some mixture. The research assistants were always told they should not look on this as a road to promotion. They were supposed to finish their work at the university and go off somewhere. They were, in those days, permanent research assistants. They were women, several women who had worked for many years at the Bureau. Two of them worked for Simon Kuznets.
Elizabeth Jenks.
And Lillian Epstein.
Right.
And they were clearly played some important role in his work. Another one worked for Fred Mills, later for Kendrick. But most of the people were young and were expected to stay only a short time. Fabricant had come as an assistant and stayed. I did, and Anna Schwartz did.
Milton did as well.
But Milton had also, I didn't.
Yeah, Milton was Simon's research
Had come.
assistant.
Mhm.
And Simon had brought back all the surveys that were the basis of income from independent practice
Mhm.
in the 30s, and he was told about this mathy student at Columbia, and he brought Milton into the project as a research assistant, and then of course Milton stayed with that
Yeah.
project. So
But it
many.
It was considered unusual, and
Yeah.
it was not, the staff members were not encouraged to include their research assistants as co-authors. In fact, there was a couple of episodes in which, at least one I knew of, where a staff member was prevented from doing that. If you thought very highly of the contribution of the research assistant, then publication would come out with the assistance of somebody who was a research assistant. So I was given a project. I think, because this was desired for the business cycle program, and Fabricant thought of me as someone to do it.
All that time, though, you did have a sense that you would eventually get your degree. That somehow you would.
I didn't think much about
you didn't
it.
think.
I didn't think much about it, and the Bureau always emphasized that they didn't care whether I got a degree or not. And once once it was clear that I was a long-term employee, they emphasized that I shouldn't worry about that. They didn't particularly want me to get it. So I didn't think too much of it. And at some point I decided it would be a good idea. And I had to retake some of my exams and spent a year doing all these things.
How much, you may not know the answer to this question, but Arthur Burns, for example, he's full-time faculty. He's probably half-time in terms of the number of courses he has to teach at Columbia because of his position at the Bureau. He comes in probably every day to the Bureau. No?
I wouldn't be, I doubt it.
Mm-hmm.
Now his era at the Bureau then came to an end with Eisenhower's
Right.
election. So
Right.
that was a period, I guess, when he was most active at the Bureau, most the largest presence for all of us. I mean, if you saw him, you could go in and talk to him if you
Mm-hmm.
wanted to. Then when he left, Fabricant became director of research. And that led to a change in emphasis in the Bureau, because Fabricant's interests were not primarily business cycles. He was more interested in long-term issues, productivity and economic growth and so on. So if you look at the annual reports of those years, see
Right.
major change in the subjects. I think he wrote one about business cycles, but the others were all different topics.
And Fabricant stays as the director of research until when?
Well, I'm not sure, but when Burns returned in '57, I believe, then he became the president of the Bureau, and now the positions changed in importance, because now he once again became the dominant figure, and he was very dominant. I began to have some administrative role at that point, so I would sit in on meetings, and everyone deferred very much to him, so that the director of research was no longer the final word on. He came back as president and ruled the Bureau until he left again.
And that was when?
Well, I guess he left the time of Nixon's campaign.
So he left in he left in '59, so that was like 2 years.
He had this period as chairman of the council,
Uh-huh.
and I guess until when he
Which
came
I meant
back.
56.
He came back
yeah.
in '57, I believe, and I think he was then the president till '66.
Right.
When John Meyer.
When John
was-
took over. That's right.
Right.
There are so many questions that I want to get to. Let me just say one thing, which is I've been reading Milton Friedman's autobiography and some notes of Milton's, and Milton it has a lovely statement about what it was like when he moved from the government to the Bureau. And of course it's Milton, so we have to be very careful here. But Milton said of what Burns, I think it was Burns, not Mitchell, had said to him. And he said, this is a difficult project that you're going to do. It's going to take a long time. sit down, do the research. In a couple of years, you'll have the answer. And he was overjoyed. This was research. This
Yeah.
wasn't, okay, turn it over in a couple of months.
Right.
This was sit back, think hard, because we want it done right. Is that the sense that, is Milton telling us exactly what was going on, or is this
Well,
just
I think
Milton's
very much
world?
so. No,
Yes.
I think that was very much
Okay.
so, because that's what I was told.
Yeah.
Also, in fact, I mean, when I was just working as an assistant, that was emphasized. This was a calling, and this was an exciting thing to do. A fabricant loved the work, and he thought it was the best thing in the world to be doing. And the Bureau was so different in organization at that time. I think they thought of themselves as pioneers and as people who were doing something very different from the academic profession, and that this was the only place where you could do. It was the home of empirical research, and very few professors were doing empirical research. There wasn't support for it, there wasn't real encouragement or great interest in it, but this was what these people thought was the key to really learning about the economy. And I think this goes back to Mitchell's ideas, to somewhat to institutionalist economics. I mean, there were a number of strands that entered into this, but that meant partly that the Bureau was going to do authoritative work. They were going to take whatever time was necessary for it. They were going to do new things that people hadn't done, and they were going to do them right. So that was behind the idea that you had this very elaborate procedure before anything got published. Everyone was an employee of the Bureau. You didn't publish outside. You expected to have your work come out as Bureau publications. And it would have to go through, when you finished a manuscript, first of all you would give seminars to talk about. Then when you finished a manuscript, a reading committee of your colleagues would go through it. And that was a very serious going over that it got. People took each other's work seriously and really.
So when you gave seminars, they were in-house seminars,
Yes.
or you would take it on the road?
No,
In-house. And when you gave an in-house seminar, was it, were people asked to come who were not at the Bureau, but who Burns may have thought had an interest, could add something?
I can't remember, but they were basically in-house seminars. Maybe some others came, but the place where you got most of your comment, criticism, was from your colleagues.
And so who, for you, the best criticism was from?
Well, I guess frequently from Fabricant,
Right.
Since he had entrusted the project. When I presented my book, Ilse Mintz was one of them, and Jacob Mincer was on the committee. I'm not sure how the third one was, I don't remember. But they got a very thorough review, and that also had a lot to do with what you would, what the reviewers said had something to do with your future at the Bureau. And then after that, it went to a committee of directors, and they were also often very
Right.
thorough.
The
and had
reviewers
very strong opinions.
were anonymous, I mean,
They weren't anonymous.
They were not.
No. It was,
But the reviewers were chosen by the director, by
Right.
the research director of
Yes.
the Bureau. Just as is the case today, although it's a little more of a rubber stamp today.
yes, I don't think people take the time that was taken then because they're not full-time. This is not that was considered part of your duties, and these are full-time people.
So the
Mostly.
reviewer would be an in-house person, not someone who would be chosen
Yes, I
outside.
think sometimes they would send it out to someone, but basically, the
Right.
real review was
Right.
your colleagues.
Now, so we're sort of chronologically we're going from 45 up to the 60s. That's the period that you've just been talking about. And of course you finish this project, the project that becomes your dissertation, in about 61. Is that right, or just before?
Well, I finished probably the manuscript in 1960.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, but it starts through this process, which took several years before publication. And I think around that time, or maybe 59, I began working also with Raymond Goldsmith, who had a big bureau project that I also became the co-author of, on studies in the national
Right.
balance sheet. So in 59, 60, 61, I was also working.
So you're working on
that as
various
well.
things. Now, the price and quantity trends in the foreign trade of the U.S. was a Princeton Studies in International Economic Relations piece. That was not a bureau
Yeah,
piece.
no, it's a bureau.
Oh, it is a
Princeton was
bureau.
a bureau publisher
Okay.
in those days.
It's interesting that it doesn't come up as a bureau publication in Hollis.
Really?
Everything else does,
Oh.
but this one doesn't. It comes up as part of the Studies in International Economic Relations #2.
But they
It
were
does
all,
not
those were
and
all
they were
Princeton
all
volumes for the bureau.
for the bureau.
Right, that's the
Okay.
bureau title.
Here I thought that I discovered something, but in fact I haven't discovered anything at all. Who was Doris Preston?
She started as my research assistant on a project,
Uh-huh.
on the trade project, and then the bureau got a grant. I think it may even have been an NSF grant, which was to start. The bureau had a lot of construction data that it had received and analyzed over the years, and the idea was to put this out for general use, but that to look them all over, annotate them in great detail. And this was supposedly going to be the beginnings of doing this for all the bureau series, all those series that are now in the, but it became obvious that it took so long just to do the construction
Right.
the statistics that was never continued.
So during the long period that you've just been discussing, lots of people came and went in the bureau. Anna, for example, was around all that time, although physically she was not always at the bureau because she
Right.
had these
But
4
she was
kids,
associated
and
with the bureau.
she was associated with the bureau.
Right.
But you would see her every now and then, or?
Yes, we didn't know her well. She was quite apart from the rest of
Yeah.
us.
Would you see Milton?
Well,
He
that
was-
must have been
he
a
was-
short period. There was a
right.
short period when he would be around that we'd see him, but I'm not sure when he left for.
And what about Simon?
Simon was around, but Simon was somewhat aloof. He was on a different floor with his staff, and I saw him later because I became involved in the post-war capital market study. and which he was director of. But if it had not been for that, he did come to sometimes or presented at seminars, but again, he wasn't part of the business cycle group, and he was it was a different group.
And then he went to Penn, and then he went to Hopkins. Or do I have that reversed?
No, that's right.
That's right. And then he went to Harvard. So when he went to Penn, I guess he no longer came to the Bureau.
I'm not sure whether he was already at Penn when we did the post-war capital markets.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little hard for me to remember all the dates. That came out in a series of volumes, which his was the last, I think, over quite a long period of time, and he became less and less present as this went along. And I think a lot of it was done while he was not any longer very much at the Bureau, although I think both Lillian Epstein and Elizabeth Jenks remained during that period.
Right.
So,
I would have loved to have met them. Of course, I've met Simon, but not. What were they like, Lillian and Elizabeth?
Two very different women. Elizabeth Jenks is an unmarried lady, not just unmarried, but seemed to be a spinster type, rather sharp-tongued, lived by herself in a big house in Queens, which I think had been her parents' house, very devoted to Simon, what she was doing. Lillian Epstein was a more easier person. And I think perhaps was a little bit, maybe somewhat more capable, but they were both.
Did they have
capable.
training in statistics or economics or not? Neither.
They must have had undergraduate degrees, but that's all. I don't think either one did graduate work. If anyone did, Lillian might have, but they were not. I think basically most of these people, they and Maud Peck and Sophie Sakowitz, under undergraduate degrees. Sophie's may have been in statistics, I'm not sure.
Two things about the Bureau. Politics and the two parts of economics, applied versus empirical. So let me group these questions. Did you ever have a sense at the Bureau that there was this other world of politics, that there were people who were Republicans and people who were Democrats, and there were people who would think of the era of the New Deal one way and people who might think of it another way, and there were people who were going into the 50s who were once again Republicans and people who were Democrats. So what was there, and of course Burns at the helm, just as Marty here, it reflects one political view. But sometimes you can have an academic atmosphere which is completely apolitical. So that's one question. The second one, somewhat unrelated, but has to do with the environment, is was there ever a sense that you got that economics was moving more into theory, and that these foundations of economics were coming into the Bureau, or being in some sense held at bay at the Bureau, or that it didn't really matter?
Well, those are different issues.
Completely different.
Politics, there were some, there were people who had very strong opinions. And Leo Wohlman, who was the labor economist, had very strong, very conservative views. And I wasn't even conscious of Burns' views and was rather surprised that he was well placed among Republicans when he went to. We thought of him. My wife once came to a talk that he gave, and he had a way of mumbling under his breath. He was not an all inspiring speaker or teacher to me, and she was sure that he would not go far in the world. So for him to take on this very public role was, for me, a great surprise, which may reflect my poor judgment or the way he appeared to us at the Bureau. It certainly was very, I don't think there was much discussion of political issues as it applied to the research at all. At some point, probably a little bit later, an issue came up about people making political statements, and Bob Shea, who was at Columbia, was doing one of the consumer finance studies, wished to write a letter to make some kind of public statement. And I think the Bureau was a little unhappy at first, but they finally issued guidelines for people who wished to make these statements. He was a very active Democrat, and he wanted to present his views in some public forum. And so it was decided that how people should identify themselves and make it clear that this was not a Bureau, not a Bureau position in any way. And to some way this goes back to the origins of the Bureau, which you've probably read about, and this consciousness of sort of being above political disagreement, that is, that you bring together people of very different political views, but nevertheless that what would come out would be of such high quality that people of the different political views would accept these authoritative
a very
results.
positivistic view of economics, that you can be completely nonpartisan, non-political, non-ideological.
Well, I mean, the people themselves were known to be ideological, but that
right.
you could produce work
Exactly.
that would not be subject to that
Right.
criticism.
Right.
And so the whole board approval system was in part designed for that, because you'd have the labor union representative and the business-oriented representative who would be often on the same, reading the
Right.
same manuscript, and you really had to get it by both of them.
And what about the possible division between theory and applied? And I sort of brought these questions together because they are part of sort of a philosophical notion that you can have sort of something pure and positivistic about economics. So we could leave the political aside, and at the same time, it really doesn't matter if it's theoretically grounded or empirically grounded or econometrically
Right.
grounded, that there is a single truth that we will aim for.
Of course, the accusation of measurement without theory
Yes.
was very painful, I think, and there was some effort to answer that kind of comment. I think Mill's book on prices got some of the same
Right.
kind of criticism. In a way, the existence of the Bureau was partly a reaction to the way the academic profession had its interests, mainly theoretical, and while I think everyone would have denied any dislike of theory or certain types of theory, I think that runs through Wesley Mitchell's lecture notes, that there was, he was very interested in unorthodox theories of all sorts. And that's, I think, built into his philosophy. So he wouldn't have thought of himself as in opposition to theory, but in opposition to
a single theory.
Orthodox
Yes.
economics theory. I think, and that was, I think there, no matter what people said about it, I think that was underlay certainly his viewpoint.
It's interesting, in Milton's memoirs, he has only the highest compliments concerning Mitchell. He never says anything about measurement without theory and the eclecticism of Mitchell's theoretical underpinnings.
Mm-hmm.
There's a great story about, I don't know if I told you this the last time, about how Kuznets and Friedman wrote a first draft of a paper on income from independent practice. Did I tell you this? And they gave it to Mitchell, and Mitchell came in and he as Milton said, he raised holy hell. He said, Milton.
About writing.
Yes. And so he certainly holds Mitchell up as the great teacher in many different in different ways. Well, we're almost out of time. We have hit on just about all the questions that I put down here. Some concerning the role of the government in the Bureau. Do you have any comments on that?
My understanding in the early period was that the Bureau wanted to stay aloof from the government. It was made a point that it would only do something on a special request from the government, such as something like the Price Statistics Review Committee or the National Accounts Review Committee. And there had been earlier studies done at the request of some government agency. And then that changed tremendously with John Myers coming, because one of his innovations, and what he thought, was that the world had changed and the place to go for economic research money was the government. And he began much more active search for government funds. It's hard to say. The environment changed also, because funds became available that had not, I'm not sure when NSF began supporting economics. So the world changed, and that meant the academic community changed, because people could get government funding, which made the Bureau change. And if you think of the changes that took place in the organization of the Bureau, it wasn't that people got different ideas, but the world changed, and the Bureau really had to adapt, and it took quite a while to adapt to a very different relationship with the academic community.
So did Burns have, he obviously had very good relations with Rockefeller Foundation, so there must have been someone at Rockefeller who looked to the Bureau and looked to Burns, realizing that this was a great place to...
Mitchell, probably.
Okay.
And Burns inherited this relationship. I think there are things in minutes, but I don't remember
Right.
now who were the people they dealt with.
But that was just an extremely important, it was a gigantic grant of money that the Bureau received, and then that it drew on for a long time after.
Yes, but the main thing was the Rockefeller Foundation supported the Bureau, supported its current
Right.
budget for many years.
Right.
And then in the 1950s,
It
we had this
endowed. Right.
change to getting a grant, Rockefeller and Ford both, and that also changed the Bureau's financial situation, because there was now, for the first time, an endowment
Right.
on which one could draw, and that gave a certain stability,
Right.
which had not been there before. I mean, it was a very hand-to-mouth
Right.
operation,
Did you have
especially
this-
in the early
yes.
period.
Did you have a sense in the hand-to-mouth operation, there was, as you said, the business cycle project, which, we could look at the financial statements and see what fraction of the funds it took. And then there were all these other projects, and we know exactly which ones they were. And did you ever have a sense that some of them were being done because there was, the American Council on Life Insurance or whatever, that they were, that their focus came from the funding itself?
Oh, there was no question, I think,
Mhm.
that there was a certain mutual interest. I mean, the American Council of Life Insurance was the biggest by far, but the Association of Reserve City Bankers, there was the Hillside program, which I haven't said anything about, which
Right.
I'm not sure whom you could find someone to talk about, which until 1954 was totally separate.
And what was it?
That was the financial research program, and it was in a state up on the Hudson in Riverdale, and we didn't know those people.
Who were the people?
Well, Saunier was there,
Uh-huh.
and David Durand, a
Uh-huh.
whole group of others who put out these financial
Yes.
research volumes. And it was also the technological leader of the Bureau, because they were the first to have computers, what were called computers in those days. And when they moved down to Manhattan, that's when most of us first began to have experience.
So what year are you thinking about?
54.
Right. And so we're thinking about a little mainframe of some sort.
It wasn't a mainframe, it was a collection of IBM. This was all a sort of partnership with IBM. I think
Right.
they were provided maybe free to the Bureau, but there were punch card machines, and
Okay.
one machine did multiplications.
Right. Right.
It was,
My father ran an IBM data outfit for a textile manufacturing firm. And so, my understanding of how computers evolved is going to see him and seeing what his office looked like,
oh,
and how it evolved from punch cards to then the
Right.
360. Right.
well,
And I
so-
imagine this is somewhat the same.
Yes, but that changed the operation of the Bureau tremendously
Right.
in terms of research assistants
Right.
and what they did.
Right. I mean, we forget that when you had a research design, and correct me if you think this is wrong, when you had a research design, you also had to think about how much it was going to cost you per data point that you were producing. And when you're doing this all with Marchand calculators, it's going to cost you a lot.
Oh, yes, and you just didn't do many things that you did
Right.
very easily later. I think Brad Hickman was one of the people at Hillside, put out the 3-volume study on bonds. That was supposed to be what started Michael Milken
Yes.
to thinking about The fact that you could do better with low quality. You could average out risks on low quality bonds. And that, I think, was a computer, for the Bureau at that time, computer intensive study. All this that I described, the seasonal calculations and also the business cycle analyses, eventually was computerized.
And so in your sense, the Bureau, you see a real switch in the mid-50s to computers at the Bureau?
No, it just began rather slowly. Right. And it was a small, for my dissertation, I worked with those IBM computers, and I used to come in on the weekends and would move 60,000 cards at,
Right. And so you were programming in COBOL, Fortran, Snowball. What?
No, these machines were plugged.
Yes.
Were programmed by plugging.
By plugs. My father used to come home with these great big boards.
Right.
So this is the era of the boards.
We had a person who.
And you had your little flow chart, and then you would.
Yeah. Well, we had someone who would do that, and give him instructions. Yes. But it would take so long to run that I said I would come in weekends and run these things.
But there were also the group of research assistants who would work with Simon's research assistants, for example, who would work with great big pieces of paper and multiply things this way and multiply them this way and add them this way.
Right? Yes. And the work with Goldsmith, that project never, even though the balance sheets were quite complex, never was computerized.
Right.
If it had been later, clearly would have
right.
been.
Well, even in my own memory, I could remember when you didn't go to the computing center to do things, and you sat around your house and looked at log tables and things. So it's been a long process. I'm being told here that I think we have 5 minutes. Are there any last things that you want? We talked about so many things. We can of course have another appointment to do another hour of this if you want.
Well, it's up to you. I mean, many things changed, of course, after over these years. John Meyer came in 1967 because the Bureau was losing support really from foundations, and there was a move to force Burns to step down or to really change the focus of the Bureau. And that was mainly the idea the Bureau was slow on econometrics and there was a dispute about whether it was antagonistic to econometric work. But most of us felt it was, and that so Meyer was going to be one of the big changes with his entry. I don't know if you know that about a year after he came, Burns tried to have him removed, and that there was a major effort. Burns was very angry with him, and all of us were interviewed by the board as to what that must be in the board minutes if you have them. Very interesting, and Meyer, of course, won. And that really was the end of Moore's very strong influence as Burns' successor in a way.
Right.
And Moore, of course, went to Washington and came back later. So that was a whole new era, very different, to different people, different way of organizing. And then, I guess during this period, the idea of the Bureau as the sort of employer, and really began to weaken. People began to demand to publish outside to some degree. So this was in a way the transition to Marty's era, which is such a different way of running the organization.
Right.
And almost just all the full-time people left, starting perhaps in the 50s, and certainly by the 60s. And the Bureau no longer was going to be the full support of anybody.
Right. Well, I have 1 minute left, and I want to end on an upbeat note, which is Robert Lipsey has been here at the Bureau in the new incarnation of the Bureau at the ITI conference, and you didn't begin with who you are now. So can you just say that you are a professor of...
Oh, so I'm Professor Emeritus now.
Yes.
City University of New York, and a director of the New York office and research associate of the Bureau.
And enjoying the new incarnation of the Bureau,
And
perhaps.
having a wonderful time.
Okay. I think I have to turn this off. Okay.